Campside Media.
Hi Campside listeners, welcome to Inside the Tent, our series where we go behind the mic of our podcasts and talk to the people who brought them to life. I'm Joe Barrett, a producer working with Campside, and today I'm going to talk with Josh Dean about the new weekly version of the hit narrative show Chameleon. The show's about people who transform and deceive. Con artists, scammers, imposters, people pretending to be something they're not. If you want more behind-the-scenes content from our shows and the people who make them, head to joincampside.com to become a free member of the Campside community. That's joincampside.com. Now, here's my conversation with Josh. Hello, Josh.
Hi, Joe.
So I know you from making White Devil with you, and I've worked on a few other series for Campside as a producer, but I'm new to the world of Chameleon. Can you tell me a bit about the evolution from Hollywood Con Queen to this show? And maybe what is that show for people who may not have heard it? Yeah,
sure. First off, Joe's underselling himself a little bit. Yes, he made White Devil with me. He also produced our most recent Sony show, Where's Daniel Morecambe, Barry Rothbart's show. So Joe's basically a member of the family. One of our favorite producers, and which is why I asked him to work on Chameleon with me, because this is a very important franchise for us as we moved into an era where weekly shows became a larger part of the slate. It was one of the first things we thought about, was doing a weekly adaptation of this franchise. So I should go back to the beginning because that's really where it starts. Campside was born in, depending how you measure it, 2019 or 2020, but it really was born because we started working on the first season of Chameleon, Hollywood Con Queen, which was originally just called Chameleon, by the way. We added Hollywood Con Queen, I think, in week 3 of release. So myself and Vanessa Gregoriadis, one of the co-founders here, one of my partners, started working on a show in the fall of 2019 about an investigation into the identity of a person who was pretending to be various Hollywood power players, mostly studio chiefs and major producers, in some cases directors, luring what we call below-the-line talent, so stuntmen and hairstylists and photographers, and to go to Indonesia and participate in a film that did not exist. And that season of Chameleon, which became Campside's first ever podcast, led to a franchise. We did 8 seasons, I think, including probably our most famous show, Wild Boys, which became season 3. And I would say of all the dozens of limited series Campside has made, and it's become the form that we specialize in. And so they defined this franchise that is now moving into its new era as a weekly show where we do one story per week.
So, maybe just first to spell it out, what is it that links those series together?
So I think when Chameleon was born, we didn't know what it would be. We just did this con artist story that became very famous. But then pretty quickly realized, people loved that story. We should look for other stories like it. If you were to boil it down to its, most basic explanation, it's sort of cons and frauds. But I like to say what we're doing now is just people pretending to be something they aren't. It might not necessarily be a fraud or a con involved. Could be someone who took on a persona accidentally, or not necessarily to win money or fool people. But I hope over the course of what we're doing in this weekly series, we will explore all the many ways that people put on masks and pretend to be something that they aren't. And I hope we're kind of redefining it as we go along. That said, it will still be, at its heart, mostly stories about impersonations and cons and frauds. And there seems to be an endless fascination for that.
Yeah, I think it's clear. And actually, last week I was explaining to a friend about what I'm doing, and halfway through the conversation they were like, oh yeah, Chameleon, I listened to that when it first came out. So, for me, as I'm reading about these stories and starting to dig into it, the idea of somebody pretending to be something else from themselves is so appealing, because to me, it's just why would people do this? And there always seems to be that question hanging there. And sometimes what I'm learning is sometimes you get close and sometimes, the mystery hangs.
you may never know. In a bit of a, I guess to say spoiler alert, teaser, whatever you want to call it, we will be revisiting the Hollywood Con Queen story as part of Chameleon. I have been in communication with the suspect extensively over the past year, and I hope we will do an update of that story, probably an arc of episodes. But one of the burning questions, I feel like we helped identify that suspect on that show. We told the most definitive version. We spent months investigating the story. And yet still today, I don't totally understand what he was after, what he was doing, the why of it all. And I think you and I, as we've started to do interviews and report on these other stories, it feels like almost every one you come to a point when you're like, but why did they? And there's not always a satisfying answer, which makes it really interesting because, yes, money is always a motivator, or sex or power or whatever. But that's definitely not always the case. Sometimes you're just like, this person went to great lengths and did something very complicated for a very long time without getting caught, and I don't totally know why. And that's kind of fascinating. And I think hopefully people still enjoy the stories even when the why is unclear, because I think the journey is often very satisfying. One reason we all love con stories is because it's so many of them are in to use the cliches like Stranger Than Fiction or WTF stories where you're just like, whoa, that happened? Like, why did that happen? How did that happen? And there's a lot of process that we can unpack because we can tell people how they happened. We can unpack the con as it was laid out, the mechanics of it. But we can't always get at the why, and that's interesting. And hopefully when I do come back to Hollywood Con Queen, I will be able to answer that question. I'm still not sure I have.
What I'm finding is like you start off by putting yourself in the position of the con person, the person who's pretending, and just that's an interesting place to put your imagination. But then obviously you're also on the side of the person being scammed, and it's so easily done, particularly in today, a world of AI and very blunt scams coming at us at emails and on our phones basically every day. Do you think about that? Like, it does feel to me like this is a time where this resonates a bit differently.
Yeah, I think, we started this thing 6 years ago, not knowing that it would become a franchise that could be a weekly show that feels very well timed, because almost every day I get a text message from someone that clearly is up to something. It's always like, hi, sweetheart, what are you doing tonight? Or like some crypto lead, and it's all scams. Or like you said, AI, we can't believe video anymore. We can't trust audio anymore. There's so many ways to fool people. But the reality is people were always susceptible. I think we'll do historic scam stories in the show, and what you'll find is that it's not hard to prey on people's insecurities and hopes and dreams and desires, and often it's either ambition or blackmail, or there's all kinds of triggers that make a scam effective. And I think the difference is right now, for one thing, we're carrying around a computer in our pocket where people can reach us at any moment. It also possesses all of the data about us, so people can know more about us than was ever possible in the history of humans. And then they can impersonate us and impersonate people that we know and famous people and voices. And I think we will not run out of stories.
I think part of it is that we've all, as human beings going around the world, we've got to trust each other to make it work. So there's always going to be that question in that, is this real or not?
Yeah, you're right. We have to trust each other in order to be functioning as humans in society. Going back to Con Queen again, hearing these stories from people, on the one hand, you're like, oh, big deal. You flew to Indonesia and you had to buy your own plane ticket and you got a crazy party story out of it, and who cares? But the betrayal and the hurt and the disappointment these people experienced was more about thinking that a dream was coming true, and then that dream didn't come true. And not only did it not come true, but in fact, you've been fooled and someone stole your money. It's a very insidious kind of punishment, harm to do to someone, which is not yes, it's not murder, it's not rape, it's not abduction, it's not, there's all kinds of much worse things that can happen to you, obviously. But I think there is a real mind fuck about being scammed, that you almost never trust anyone again, and that's not a great way to go through life.
Yeah, and people are really happy to talk about this stuff, which is great and interesting, and there's a real vulnerability there. But there's also a vulnerability almost in the people who are doing the scamming, and it's quite exciting to talk to some of those people and get an insight into that, because if there's one thing that's becoming clear to me, it's that people who do these scams are quite proud of it, and maybe they're the kind of people who actually just want as much attention they can get.
I think so. We will hear from all kinds of, obviously a lot of victims. We'll hear from a lot of journalists who covered these stories. We'll hear from investigators and other characters who played roles. But I do hope and expect that we will talk to some scammers and try and get at the psychology directly. But you're right. I do think there's some pride in the accomplishment. And in some of these cases, it almost feels like it had to be about almost trophies, that the metric for succeeding or winning was how many people you fooled, because it certainly doesn't seem like the best way to make money, for instance. Like, if that's what's driving you, there's way better ways to steal money from people than to develop an elaborate plot that has to work over and over again in order to make a couple thousand bucks a time. But then there's all kinds of other, what I hope we avoid, although we won't entirely avoid it, is like stories where the motive was like truly evil or insidious. I mean, I think we'll do that, but I don't want it to become just a franchise that like celebrates truly terrible people. Because I think so far, what I'm finding, I don't know if you agree, is that I don't dislike all these people. Even the ones who seem like serial offenders, I'm sort of like, this is a very interesting person that I don't hate.
Do you have maybe a couple of examples of stories you've really enjoyed that are coming out, to just give people a sense of what to expect?
So the first two that launched this week, which I believe this is dropping on the same day, so some people may hear this first, are like pretty interesting examples of the range of episodes we're going to do. One is the story of a music manager in the 1960s who saw an opportunity to take a very, somewhat famous and successful British band called the Zombies and put them on tour in the United States, featuring a bunch of guys who weren't actually in the Zombies. So basically a bunch of fake musicians, real musicians pretending to be someone else, went out and toured with some success for a year. Two of those guys went on to start ZZ Top, which is kind of and I think this is also a thing we're finding, is that there's often like a very entertaining second chapter or final twist in some of these stories. It's sort of like that story is fascinating in its own right, but then when you find out two of the guys became ZZ Top, that's a real what? And I should say that, and that's a good example of one where we're building on the work of another journalist. I think a lot of episodes, like I definitely am not trying to or planning to take credit for finding and discovering all of these. Hopefully we are finding and discovering plenty, but often we're here to celebrate the work of someone else. So you'll hear the journalist who broke that story in that episode. And then the other one that launches on the first day is another of my favorites, which is about a 14-year-old kid in Chicago who successfully pretended to be a Chicago police officer on multiple occasions. And that one is, sort of bittersweet, heartbreaking. I don't know, because he's not a bad actor, doesn't seem like a bad person, just really wanted to be something and couldn't figure out how to get there the right way. And like many of our stories, because we're revisiting a story, and that one's now about, I forget, 12 or 15 years old, we're able to update it and figure out what's happened since the story was first well known. And there's often an interesting update to these. So those are the first two. And then we've got a number. I mean, I would say one of the most common recurring themes so far is adults pretending to be kids. And I think we've only begun to mine that one. There's a lot out there. We've got another one where, following up on the work of a great Ringer journalist named Justin Sales, who made a podcast called The Wedding Scammer, about a guy that he pursued in the similar way that we pursued the con queen, who seemed to be scamming people who were trying to throw weddings by promising services that were not delivered or under-delivered, and just doing it over and over again.
There's something which maybe you haven't thought about, and I just thought about it now, but several of those ones that you've just spoken about are very American in their scamness. Like, they rely on a idea of America and a sort of sense of American culture. So it's interesting for me, not being from the States, to learn about that and see about that. But actually, quite a lot of these stories do travel around the world, and it's quite interesting to see how the scams operate in different places, or how they rely on different places. So the one we did about Folieri, which is Anne Hathaway's ex-boyfriend, you have to really understand what was going on in his life in Italy to really understand how the part of the chapter that played out in America happened, which is really interesting. And then
Yep.
there's another one which I really like is the book publishing scam that sort of...
Spine Collector. That one? Oh, no,
No,
Page
the
Turner.
Page Turner.
There's multiple publishing scams already.
It's all around the world and it relies on so many different intersecting things. And we're going to be going around the world, well, not necessarily actually traveling, but stories from different places, which is another thing. Like I'd never heard of the Barefoot Bandit, but that you tell me is a story that everybody in America is quite familiar with. But even saying that, just being able to go to some of these stories that people might be familiar with and really dive into it, I think is going to reveal a lot and be pretty interesting.
Yeah, I think every country will have stories that are very well known to that country's population and not well known outside. So yeah, Barefoot Bandit, good example of one that for a moment here in the early 2000s was hugely famous. But you had to be consuming media in that moment. I think we call him the first folk hero of the social media age. And again, that's a good example of one where he's not scamming. He's just pretending to be something that he isn't. And in that case, it's like a pilot. But yeah, we've talked about some British stories. The publishing scam story, the one you mentioned, that's largely based in the Philippines. And then another publishing scam featuring an Italian. That's a very international story. It involves someone who scams book publishers all over the world and I think 9 different languages. Again, an example of wow, these people are actually very talented. If only they had applied their skills to something legitimate, probably could have been really successful. But no, they'd rather do this really risky, which I guess is probably part of the motivation, right? The thrill is the risk.
Absolutely. A lot of people will probably know you from these longer narrative series, and making a weekly show is a kind of different kettle of fish. And I was just wondering, how does it feel different and what are you excited about?
It feels both very intimidating because on the one hand, I think there's an endless universe of stories. On the other hand, we have to find them and find a way to tell them and execute them week after week, and that's a little bit daunting. But also really exciting. I think I love making limited series, and I know you do too, and we've made several together. But there's also something very satisfying when it comes out, but also frustrating. They're so slow, right? They sometimes take years to make. So you work on this thing month after month, year after year, and then it finally comes out and it runs for 8 weeks and it's over. And it's not that you aren't proud of it or thrilled with the reaction or whatever, but it just feels like you do all this work and then it comes out and then it's over. I think there's something exciting about being able to do this week after week. And hopefully we can deliver the same kind of listener excitement or whatever they get out of listening to our limiteds if we pull this off. I feel like for the most part, people love a limited series, but at the end, they're still that was a fun story, and I'm glad I listened to it. And that's what we want to capture here too, which is we're not asking for 6 or 8 hours of your time. We're asking for 40 minutes a week, but that's a lot, right? I know people have all these other shows they're listening to. You have to find time in their commute or their subway ride or their drive or their jog or whatever. We're either bumping something else aside or asking for an additional 40 minutes, and I think that puts a lot of pressure on us to be entertaining, to not drag these out as much as we might want them to sometimes be an hour. There's a big difference between an hour and 35 minutes, right? And I make podcasts, and as a consumer, sometimes I'm I don't have time for 55 minutes of podcast, right? And then if you get separated, if you break off a story in the middle, you might not pick it back up. So I think I feel some pressure to be entertaining and provide something new to people, but that's exciting too. Yeah, I don't know. It's new for you too. How do you feel about it?
I think it's quite exciting because it is completely new for me. And I feel like it's almost it's not one hit. So you can we spent 2.5 years making White Devil, I think. And by the time it came out, we just had no idea necessarily how it was going to be received. But I think with something like this, it's coming out every week. So there's an opportunity for it to grow and develop. And there's a more immediate feedback loop with a group of people who are listening, and also with us creatively trying to find a voice for what it is.
I think the challenge for us is, on the one hand, it comes out every week, so there's less pressure to have every week be perfect. It's sort of is it entertaining and do we feel like we did a good job? That's great. On the other hand, I feel like we do have to try and keep the bar high and constantly look for ways to surprise people, because you also don't want it to become formulaic where people are just like, I know what I'm going to get. To the extent that anyone listening to this is like, I hope people bring us original stories. I hope we get emails with suggestions. You briefly mentioned Raffaello Folieri. I think we'll do some zeitgeisty, more famous stories too. Either stories that we feel like people missed or didn't understand or are old. But we're very open to suggestions. So anyone, listening to this, or hopefully who listens to the weekly episodes of Chameleon, we really want to hear your feedback, including story ideas. And no scam is too small. I would love to do original stories that are like some very tiny scam in a small town that doesn't have to have been wide in scope or rich in its take. I just think these are interesting stories that people want to listen to. Cautionary tales.
On that, just to end, Josh, is there a instance of you being scammed that you're willing to admit to?
Knock on wood, I have not been scammed. Maybe because I'm so skeptical of everything because I've reported on so many of these things that I'm like, but I mean, I feel like my wife recently was almost like scammed by one of those things where you click a link in an email. It was something to do with the post service. Like, you have to keep your guard up all the time. So I would not be upset if someone did scam me during the course of making Chameleon so that we could make an episode about it, not to get meta, but, or you, Joe, if you get scammed, we'll investigate.
I'm scammed all the time. Absolutely scammed all the time.
This is not a real podcast, Joe. I've set you up. I'm not sure why or what my goal is, but there is no Chameleon, Joe.
Wouldn't surprise me. Okay, thank you, Josh.
Right. Yeah, I'm happy to have you on board and excited for people to hear this.
Yeah, can't wait. You can hear Chameleon Weekly wherever you get your podcasts from the 13th of November. Thanks again to Josh Dean and the rest of the Chameleon Weekly team, Emma Simonov, Ashley Warren, Tiffany Dimmack, and Blake Rook. Thanks to Ewan Lai Tremuan and Mark McAdam for our theme. And thank you for listening to Inside the Tent. Don't forget to head over to joincampside.com to become a free member of the Campside community. That's joincampside.com.